Welcome back to my channel. I'm Brian Kafkin. In this video, I'm going to do a video I've been waiting to do for a while, which is one on Microsoft Fabric. I hope to do a series of these, but I need to start with a very quick overview of the user interface, better known as the UI. So let's jump in. Now, this screen shows you where I'm sitting in Fabric, but I'm under the Power BI experience, as they call it. I'll put a link in the description that shows you how you can enable Fabric. And once you do, when you open up the Fabric menu, which you can do by clicking on the lower left hand button, you'll see a bunch of menu options appear. Fabric calls these experiences. Now there's kind of like two types of experiences really. You have sort of tools really like Power BI, which we all know, right? You do your analytics there. Azure Data Factory, which they shorten to Data Factory as exposed through the Fabric user interface. Then we have Data Activator and Real-Time Intelligence, which really work together. Data Activator gives you some really cool features when you're doing streaming, like triggering events when something happens. You also have this thing called Industry Solutions, which I believe is really new and they're evolving it. But the idea there is that you can select this to jumpstart and kind of pick out complete end-to-end industry specific solutions. So if you're like in retail, then it's something around that. If you're healthcare, pharmaceuticals, whatever it is, banking, then you can pick solutions for that. So that's new, it's evolving, and I think it's something that will really take a while to really take shape. But it's a good idea. I think it's an interesting one because you may want to just be able to get something up and running quickly specific to your area, and that's going to be a way to do that. And there are some things already available, and we can take a look at that in a future video. As I mentioned, real-time intelligence is really like Event Hub. So think Event Hub streaming, and you could be using Kafka over that. The other options here are really more functional. They're not so much technology specific, at least not on the surface. It has this label Synapse, but don't be fooled because these are not necessarily Synapse specific things. Data engineering is an option you use. And what I want you to think of when you see data engineering is think Apache Spark. That's where we're going to create our data lakehouse, which can be used in other tools. And then we also have data science, and what you need to, of course, think of there is AI and machine learning model training and ML ops and that kind of thing. And finally, you have this option, data warehouse, which is really the sort of legacy Azure Synapse scaled out SQL Server, like a distributed SQL Server service that supports T-SQL and looks and acts like a relational database just because it basically is SQL Server but running on multiple machines. So data engineering is really talking about Apache Spark, but data warehouse is talking about Azure Synapse as integrated now in Fabric. Before we do anything in Fabric, we should create a workspace. So we can go in here to create a workspace or pick one. And I've got one I'm going to use here. What a workspace really does is think of it like a folder or a container for a solution you're building. And there's really two ways in my mind to consider how you should decide what goes into a workspace. One might be things you want to share with a team. So maybe you're doing a lot of queries and analysis, and maybe it's evolving, but you want to share it with a specific group of people. That might be a good sort of boundary to set your workspace for. You'll create something specific like finance, machine learning or something, and then create a workspace for those people. The other way to think of a workspace or create them is to do it for a specific solution, like a streaming analytics healthcare solution. You might want to create that as a separate workspace so that all of the things you're creating under that sort of are contained in it, and you can also grant permissions and things, but you can also manage and deploy things around that workspace. So workspaces are not really new. They've been around in Power BI for a while, but Fabric is going to allow us to do more things in a workspace. So rather than create a new workspace, I'm going to select this Fabric workspace. And something you'll notice on the side here is when you open things, you can see in the left panel, new menu options seem to get added. So it's a lot like a taskbar. It will put things up that you have open, and you can jump between them when you want to get back to them. Now it's really important because the user interface in Fabric can be very disorientating at times because it keeps changing depending on where you are and what you're doing. So now we are working in the, can highlight it here, the new Fabric workspace, new Fabric WS. And that's where I want to keep things. And if you notice, when we have the workspace open, we see all of the different objects contained in that workspace. So if you want to see what is in a workspace, the best thing is to just open the workspace and take a look. And I've been pretty busy in here, right? You can see I have some pipelines, I have a Fabric lakehouse, I have a warehouse, on and on these things we have. Probably the core of what you'll be working on. The beginning is going to be creating this idea of a lake house. Maybe I'll just expand this a little so you can see it better. So the idea is we create a lake house. I do want to expand on what you might consider to be a lake house if you're used to Spark or Databricks, which is simply really your regular data lake, but now you're using Delta Lake or Delta tables within it, which allow you to do sort of SQL Server-ish type of tables, right? You can update, delete, insert, those kinds of things. What's different when we have a Fabric Lakehouse is we have a new couple of things added. One is a semantic model. What's a semantic model, Brian? That's just a tabular model. Why they renamed it, I don't know. It sounds cooler to say semantic model, but it is your tabular model. This tabular model is important because by having this automatically created, it's really creating a view over your lakehouse so that you can do query and analysis against it using Power BI type services, and most importantly Power Query, because that's one of the ETL services you can use when you're in Fabric. The other thing you'll notice is SQL Analytics Endpoint. And SQL Analytics Endpoint is an important thing to get your head around, and be careful because it is not the same thing as just a SQL endpoint in something like Databricks. In this case, the SQL Analytics Endpoint points you to an Azure scaled out SQL server, in other words, Azure Synapse, and you can only use T-SQL when you use it. Now what's cool about it though is that I have a lakehouse, which is Delta tables, and I can do everything I normally could do with Apache Spark. But if I want to query it and do analysis using T-SQL, then I can go through the SQL Analytics Endpoint, and now I'm actually using the Azure Synapse engine. So that's pretty cool. It is a read-only service. You cannot write through it, but you can do analysis using both sets of tools. So what we have here is not only do we have this lakehouse, we can do querying through Power BI to the lakehouse, and we can use the SQL Analytics Endpoint to do T-SQL type of querying through it. So we have different options for how we want to use our lakehouse. I do want to caution you though, everything you're doing in your lakehouse does not necessarily appear in your semantic model. So you may have to do some work there. In fact, you will have to do some work to get your Delta tables in there and what you want to be querying on. But the SQL Analytics Endpoint will be able to show you any of the Delta tables you have in your lakehouse. And I'm going to talk about this warehouse a little bit later, but that is not automatically created when you create a lakehouse. So let's switch over to the data engineering experience. The first thing I want to point you to when you think about these things that Microsoft Fabric calls experiences, I found that term very confusing. What it really means is jumpstart. That's how I rename it. Instead of calling it an experience, just call it a jumpstart. And why do I say that? Because I'm going into data engineering and you can see all these tools. These tools at the top, these menus, are kind of a combination of different things, like wizards in some cases. Sometimes like the Medallion one's more like a template. It will give you sort of a framework, but then you have to plug in different notebooks or code you want to run. There's event analytics, as you can see. So you have a lot of different choices of what you can do here, but they're all designed to build a complete solution, right? And that's really where the experiences kick in. You also, of course, get this help below it, right? All this help stuff. But the big takeaway is that when you're in an experience, it's like a menu to a lot of wizards to help you build end-to-end solutions. The other thing you may see is these options to create certain types of objects which are relevant to the experience you're looking at. So in this case, and I'm going to roll back for a minute, what did I say before when you see the data engineering experience? I said think Apache Spark. So in this case, what can we create and work with when we want to do something in the data engineering functional area? And that is, I can create a lakehouse, which is a Spark data lake, meaning it can just hold raw flat files, but it can also hold Delta tables, so it can be both a warehouse and a data lake, making it a lakehouse. You can have notebooks, right? Different notebooks. The ones that you use in here are basically look a lot like Zeppelin notebooks, and you'll see it's very similar to what you get in HD Insight when you create notebooks for those. They're good notebooks, they're very cool, but they're not Databricks notebooks, but they're very similar. And then you have this environment and other objects potentially you could create. So that's the takeaway of what the experience is. If I scroll down, I'll see the objects that I can open when I'm in the experience menu. And it really seems to vary what you'll see depending on the experience. But when I'm in the data engineering experience, all I really get listed is my workspaces. And I'm going to actually open my workspace and go back where I was. You've noticed I've already created my lakehouse, right? And I mentioned before that a lakehouse, as you see here, is a Spark data lake that also supports Delta tables, hence a lakehouse. But I also have the semantic model, so I can query it through Power BI. and I have the SQL Analytics endpoint. So I can also do querying against it using T-SQL. And that's because under the covers, it's going to have to spin up. That's because under the covers, it's going to have to spin up a Synapse SQL service to allow me to do that. So let me open my Lakehouse for a minute. I'm going to open an object. Now what I want you to notice when I open the Lakehouse is the menu changes, right? I just went from an experience to opening up my workspace, and you notice the whole menu above just disappeared, and I was looking at something specific to a workspace, and it shows me sort of an inventory of objects that are in that workspace. Well, now I'm going to open up my Lakehouse. When I open up the Lakehouse, I had created some tables here earlier, and one cool thing that Fabric does is it automatically has minimal compute at the very least available to you, even in this edition, which I'm using, which is the free one. So I don't have to wait long. When I first come in, it may take it a few seconds to spin up that compute and get it ready. But what that tells me is, and Fabric tells you this actually, is they're running compute instances in the background and just plugging you into it, initializing it, and getting you up and running quickly. So I can view and query my tables really quickly. These are my Delta tables, which are in my Lakehouse. And so you can see, I can see dim customer and different tables I've created. And a cool thing here is I can see files. Now, because this is a Lakehouse, my files is sort of the data lake part, right? That's my flat files, and you can see these are CSV files. But when I want to load one to a table, I can do it a number of ways. Now I can always say get data up here, right? Because I'm in this place where I'm building my Lakehouse. I can upload files, which would go to my files area. I can create a data pipeline. This new Dataflow Gen 2 is really using Power Query, so it's using Power Query to do some work. I can create shortcuts to different things I want to connect to. Think of like shortcuts to like data lakes for storage and things, and I can do event stream. But what I'm going to show you here is I have files here which I already uploaded, and I can do something like I've already got most of these already created. But let's say I want to take this dim sales territory and drag it over, and it will say, oh, you can create that. Now I'll create a duplicate. I'll just put the 2 on this so that it has a new name. And the nice thing is by just dragging a file over to tables and dropping it, it's automatically going to bring it in. And it's going to use, because it's a CSV file, it can use the column headers as the column names and the separators a comma. And it will analyze the data to figure out what are the best data types to create. And you can see here it says it's loading the table. That's a pretty cool thing. So if you just want to get up and started quickly, you can upload files very quickly, drag and drop, and it'll go into the files folder, and then you can start querying them and doing your work around them. So you can see very quickly here I was able to just convert a table. And in a very short time, I now have my Sales Territory 2 table ready to use. Now, if I want to create a new semantic model, I can go here and do that. I'm not going to get into that feature, but the idea there is think Power BI. You're going to kind of drag and drop what you want your semantic tabular model to look like. If I want to work with a notebook, which most of the time that's probably how I'm going to be working with a Spark Lakehouse, I can open my existing, or I'm going to open up an old one, and I'll open up an existing one, which is, I'll just pick up this one just as an example. And this notebook has a lot of different code in it that I already used to load data into my Lakehouse. And I copied some code that was given to me in the documentation for Fabric, and they recommended, at least at that time, that you include these sort of Spark optimization settings. So I just put those in here. And I won't bother executing all this. I'm trying to do this very quickly so you just get a smattering of what's going on in the user interface. But I can do a Spark read table, and you can see this is the table I'm pulling in. I can put that into a data frame as I am here. You can see at the top of my notebook, it has a default language. So very similar to a Databricks notebook, you can set one default language, but you can always override that by using one of the magic. So %%, not the usual you would have in Databricks with a single percent, but %% SQL allows me to switch to Spark SQL, and I can do something like this. I'm creating a view within my Lakehouse, which is joining a couple of tables, Factor, Internet Sales, and Dim Date. And then you can see here, now that I've created that table, I've called vSales Info. I can query it. I do want to call attention to something here, which is I'm saying limit 5. And I did that partly to tell you this is not T-SQL, this is Spark. So don't get confused, because there are times when you will be using T-SQL, but not when you're going against Apache Spark, unless you're going through the SQL Analytics endpoint. So here I'm pulling in that view, and then I'm going to do a display. And you can just see there's a lot of stuff going on here. I'm not going to go crazy about this. I can put this notebook out on GitHub and put a link in the description, but I'm not really concerned right now that you get into all the nuts and bolts. There's a lot of pieces to Fabric, and it would be a mistake to try to jump in and understand everything right away. I found I really had to step back and try to get my head around how to navigate the Fabric workspace. So you can do that. Now I could change this too and change it to Scala or Spark SQL or R, One other thing I have in the notebooks I did want to show is I can do a chart, and there's a whole bunch of chart options I can use. So here I might say, I don't really want it to be a bar chart. I'd rather have it be a pie chart. And you get a pretty pie chart here, and depending on what you want to summarize, you can see there's a lot of control options. So that's a really nice feature. Do not confuse this notebook with Jupyter Notebooks, because typically Jupyter Notebooks only allow a single language in a notebook at a time, and there is no built-in charting capability. A couple of other things to note: we can use VS Code if we'd like to go against and do queries. You could use notebooks within VS Code or queries in VS Code, and you could read and do things against your data lakehouse. So that's a pretty cool feature. And this, of course, is running like a notebook. That's kind of where we're at as far as this goes. So if I want to go back to my lakehouse, it's kind of confusing, right? I'm in the lakehouse technically, but I'm in a notebook. So it can be a little confusing. A fast way just to get back to my overall Fabric lakehouse is to just go back here and click on lakehouse. And then I'm back in the default query view. Sometimes it's confusing even to me at this point, and I've been plugging around and playing with this for quite a while. I do feel like sometimes I'm like Little Red Riding Hood going through the woods and getting lost or something, and I need breadcrumbs. And this thing on the left, these tasks that pop up, are really pretty good breadcrumbs to get back where you were. What I wanted to also show you is when I'm in here, maybe I'd like to do something using T-SQL against the data, and I can do that by switching to the SQL Analytics endpoint. Again, menu changes magically. You are not in Kansas anymore, because what you'll notice here is that you have stored procedures now, you have tables, you do not have raw files showing anymore because this is not your lakehouse view, but you do have the tables. But these tables are now being looked at from T-SQL, from the Azure Synapse engine. And that's an important thing to realize. So if I wanted to, say, do a query, I could do a query here saying select, I'll say top, right? Because top is not supported in Spark SQL, but I'll say top 5 asterisks from, and then I can say, I'll just say dim anything, and it's nice IntelliSense, which is handy. And if I run this, and Control Enter is how I'll just run it, you can see it came back. The takeaway I want you to realize, I can open this in Excel and do some cool things, but the takeaway is I'm using T-SQL, and I can do all kinds of stuff, and you see I can do views, functions, and store procedures. I even have an information schema. This is really SQL Server, right? But it's SQL Server that's been pared down functionality, because not everything that SQL Server can do can be supported on a distributed architecture. So if you think of running SQL Server almost like in a Spark cluster, but think of SQL Server running on up to 20 nodes, we'll say, running concurrently, and it's splitting up the work, very similar to what Apache Spark does. That's really what Synapse is doing. You also have this feature called Visual Query. I won't get into that, but that allows you to do more of a drag and drop kind of look to do your queries. So this is our SQL Analytics endpoint, and if I go to the right here and just switch back to a lakehouse view, again, my menu switches around and everything changes. I'm now looking at it from an Apache Spark standpoint. And even though I've done all this jumping around, I've stayed within the context of the data engineering experience. You can see that up here. But it's not always clear exactly what that really means or how much that matters depending on where I am, because I can open up anything and it might still say it's the data engineering experience, but I'm actually doing something completely different. So it's a little, again, disorientating at times, but that's the way it's laid out. And these tasks that stay open for you are handy as a way to get back to where you were. So let's switch over now, and we're going to go from the data engineering. I'll just take a quick look at the, again, think of this jumpstart data science. And in data science, I'm seeing a lot of the same things as before. So I'm seeing all these different options available, but the idea here is that I'm going to create some sort of a data science, AI solution. And of course, on the right, you have ML models, experiments, and notebooks that we can create. So things that are specific to data science. Now, data science is an interesting area because you could argue, well, data science isn't really Spark necessarily, or it doesn't have to be Synapse necessarily. But generally, when you're doing data science or AI within Fabric, you're actually using Apache Spark. And that's because Spark has machine learning libraries available to it. And that's been extended. Also, Microsoft has extended that with a Synapse ML library that can also be used to create models and do training. So you're generally going to be doing things kind of in the Spark area. Also, the ML Ops, which is a service called MLflow, which is an open source service, is generally used from within Spark. So most of the time, I think you're going to be doing your model training and everything within the Apache Spark area. But I'm sure there's exceptions to that. Here, if I want to create a model, I can do that here. I can open an experiment. I can create a notebook if I want to, again, use machine learning and AI through a notebook. If I go down, I can see I can also now open up various workspaces to kind of do things around data science. And finally, I can go to Data Warehouse. Now, I found this difficult personally to get my head around because I have a lakehouse, and a lakehouse inherently has a data lake and a data warehouse. Hence, it's called a lakehouse. The warehouse component is really what they call Delta Lake, which is just another way of saying you got Delta tables there. The important thing about them, which is not true in the past before Delta came along, is that now you can maintain tables just like you would in some sort of a SQL database. You can do insert, updates, delete, and you got all of the commit and rollback kind of consistency things you need. So it's very powerful, and you now can create true data warehouses within the Apache Spark environment using Delta. Delta, however, is also just really an open data standard. It's not specific to Spark necessarily. It is the one that Databricks created and is associated with Spark, but it doesn't have to be the thing Spark uses. It's just what they standardized on. And why do I make that point? I make that point because Microsoft did a very interesting thing when they went to Fabric. They decided that instead of storing Azure Synapse data in their proprietary format, which they had done in the past, they said, why don't we just standardize on a data format that's anyone can read from anywhere at any time? And they chose Delta. They decided we'll use Delta tables to store Synapse SQL data warehouse tables. Even though the engine that's over the top of it is really a scaled out SQL server, which is Azure Synapse, the data storage will be Delta. And that's nice because it means we can not only query and do things using Apache Spark, but we can use T-SQL in the Synapse data warehouse, and we can interchange tools. And anything that can read Delta is going to be able to read our data even when it's originally created in Synapse. So again, now that we're in the data warehouse area, you can see again we have this menu to create things, and we also have items that are specific to working in the data warehouse area. So here's the takeaway, and this is where it can get a little confusing. Even if we do not create a Synapse warehouse, which they just call warehouse, we still have the ability to use the SQL Analytics endpoint, which allows us to use T-SQL over our Apache Spark Delta Lake. But we can also create, if we'd like, a data warehouse that is all being done in Synapse. So the Synapse sort of scaled out SQL Server. So we have a choice to do either one. We could do only Lakehouse and never create a warehouse. We could create a warehouse and never create a Lakehouse. But either way, technically, you do have a Lakehouse under the covers, or at least Delta tables, because both of them standardize on that. In my opinion, the Lakehouse is going to be pretty standard in any solutions you create. It would not be very common, I don't think, to create a solution and completely ignore creating a Lakehouse using Apache Spark. I could picture a number of situations where you'll also want to extend that with a Synapse data warehouse. It's probably particularly good if you're doing a lot of stuff with analytics and using it with Power BI. It may add some features there. However, there are two takeaways. You do not have to have both. And when you create a Synapse data warehouse, it does not know anything about the Lakehouse. So it's not automatically some sort of masking over the Lakehouse you created. They would be completely separate. And if you want to move data into it, you would have to create some sort of a task to move data between them. Have you done that, Brian? Have you created such a task? Yes, I have. So let me kind of go down here for a minute and go back to my new Fabric workspace. And if you look here, I have something here where I did a copy, and I wanted to move data from my Delta tables that were part of my Lakehouse to my data warehouse. So this task here is something that I was able to create using the wizards basically, and I was able to say here's my source, Fabric Lakehouse, taking my CSV file in this case, and my destination is moving it over to DW Fact Internet Sales. So it's very easy to do that. Again, it's within Fabric, it lets you kind of step through that. When I'm in my warehouse, if I want to do something like that, there's a number of ways I can do it. But one way right here would be to create a pipeline. So if I want to say, gee, I'd really like to create something to copy data from my data lake or Lakehouse to my warehouse, I can just create a data pipeline, and it will ask me for what do I want to create the name as, and then it will kind of walk me through the process. I'm not going to again do that here, but there's all kinds of copy assistant and wizards to help you. Okay, so that's a very quick, and I realize I'm not touching a lot of things, but I think the best way to learn Fabric, the way I'm approaching is I've really been trying to understand the UI. So I'll review this once more here. When you go to the menus here, you're doing experiences. Really the top part are more like tools that you would use. I want to use Power BI, I want to use Data Factory. The lower part are really the sort of functional areas that you want to work in. I want to do something with Apache Spark, data engineering, data lakehouse. That would be data engineering. I want to create some sort of AI machine learning solutions. I would pick data science. And if I want to work with Azure Synapse, scaled out SQL Server, then I can use data warehouse. So those are the three sort of options. And when you see these, the way I really look at them is not so much just a context in which I'm working, but more like a jump start to build things in that area. The other thing I noted is that you get these shortcuts, and these sort of get created like breadcrumbs so you can get back to things easily. They're extremely handy, I will say, so take advantage of those. We also talked about a workspace right here, And the workspace is the foundation, right? It's a container for things. So you're generally going to want to start by creating a workspace. Sometimes Fabric will prompt you and say, what do you want to call a new workspace when you do things? Because it just assumes you want a new workspace. But most of the time when you're starting something, you will want to create a workspace and then build objects in it. But the most important thing to realize is, and I'll show you again just to kind of emphasize this, is when you're doing something and you open something like I'll do here at the lake house, your menus change, everything contextually is different. Now, how are you going to learn all that and what everything does? My advice, go to the documentation. I'll put a link in the description. Microsoft Learn has a whole bunch of documentation around this. I also have a book I bought on Amazon, which is a bit salesy, admittedly. Everything is gosh golly, this is wonderful, but it does have some good information and content and example code. And Microsoft's documentation on this is pretty extensive, so you will not have much trouble, I think, figuring out pieces. One caveat I will say before I leave this sort of user interface part of it is, I did run into some compatibility issues between using Lakehouse, Apache Spark, and then using Warehouse. These tools, right, Power BI, Data Factory, Real-Time Intelligence, i.e. Event Hub, these things, all of these things really have been around. Data Activator is a new feature. While there's some new cool ideas like OneLake and OneSecurity and all that stuff, this is really an evolution of Azure Synapse. And so these tools have been here before. The other thing to realize is most of these tools were not specifically created for Fabric, or for that matter for Azure Synapse. It's really a sort of UI layer over pre-existing tools which have been here for quite a while. Data Factory's been here, I want to say like 8 or 9 years now, so it's been around a while. In that sense, it may not seem like as integrated an experience as if this was all one tool built and designed to work together. And you may get some issues with that because, again, Microsoft's trying to sort of plug different things to work together, but this was not written to be like one service. It's really written to be a service that stitches together a lot of other services. So that's it for this time. Please like, share, subscribe. Until next time, I'm pulling for you. We're all in this together. Thank you.